גם יחד, הנה מה טוב ומה נעים, שבת אחים גם יחד.
Most of us grew up with this kind of shofar. When we thought of a shofar, we thought of a ram's horn. Today, most of us think, particularly our younger people, that this is a shofar. This comes from an antelope called a kudu in the Arabian Peninsula. When I was younger, they called it a Yemenite shofar. Now it's called a shofar. This sermon is a little different in that the goal of this shofar sermon is for us to experience the shofar more profoundly. Yom Truah Yelechem, it shall be a day of the blast. And the shofar is the symbol of this day, of Rosh Hashanah as we gather together. The shofar is not only a symbol of the new year, it's also one of many symbols that embody the whole of Judaism. I don't know if you are familiar with the concept of a hologram. A hologram is a laser-created image. And what's different about a hologram is that when you drop it and it breaks, if it's made from glass, and you pick up a piece, every piece is a three-dimensional image that is the whole image. It's not like a piece of a puzzle. It's the whole image. A shofar is the whole image, as you'll see as we examine the shofar together, of the very calling of Judaism. On my mind, all the more since I returned from abroad with fresh eyes, is the challenge we have as Jews to answer the vital question, why be Jewish? What is the nature of Judaism that warrants missing a day from work today in order to celebrate a particular identity? What is the nature of that identity? The shofar has two apertures, the wide one and the narrow one. The wide one is a symbol of a universal call. Rosh Hashanah, this day, unlike Pesach, Sukkot, Shavuot, the biblical holidays that tell a story of history, Rosh Hashanah is universal. In fact, in the Mishnah, when the rabbis discuss the meaning of this day, they say that all peoples, not just Jews, but the whole of creation are God's flock, and that the whole of creation pass before God for judgment. For on this day, with the sound of the shofar, with that tekiah, we announce that the world was called into being, that this day we celebrate creation of a beloved Creator who sought to embrace each person as a shepherd cares deeply about each member of the flock. And so although not everybody out there knows it, driving on the 5 freeway or at the mall or in school, this day of Rosh Hashanah for us has cosmic significance. That's one thing to know that's distinctive about Judaism, that whatever we do on 2 planes as children of God. We do it as part of a family, an extended family, but we do it also as part of the whole family of creation. And so this large aperture is the sounds that emerge for the whole of creation, announcing today is the day of creation, and more profoundly, announcing that one day the world will become whole, that God, who is the beloved, who seeks to share creation, the mystics teach, to create out of a need to love. Why does God create? Jewish mystics teach. Because God cannot be fully manifest without an expression of love, and God therefore needs relationship. And so we as a people have a unique contribution to civilization. We not only provided 10 Commandments, we provided the concept of the Messiah, or a messianic era, that one day the world will be whole, completed. That one day that sound of the Tekiah Gedolah will be the great blast that celebrates the unity of creation. Do you know the world today has less people hungry than at any time in human history in percentage? Do you know that violence today is at its lowest, including homicides in the world? Now, we may nod saying, really? That doesn't seem to be true. I listened to a wonderful YouTube by Professor Steven Pinsker of Harvard, who's written a number of books on this topic. You know, we used to think that in horticulture times, in former gathering times, people were very good to each other. It was all flowers and seeds. And yet, as anthropologists have looked at the fragments of the skulls, they have found that from 20 to 60% of people were killed in those times in warfare. Even if you read in the Bible, and I cringe a bit with descriptions of war, they are, you kill the other side. And there is greater literacy today and opportunity than in any time in history due to technology, due to communication. But you also know that in the world today, there is greater economic disparity, there is greater suicide in percentages, and there is greater dislocation. I spoke last night about our travels. When you travel to Asia today, Nepal, India, Sri Lanka, what you find is that because we live in a world that allows for movement, there is young people leaving their families for opportunities all over the world. But that also means they're leaving families behind, wives and children, for opportunity. That quality of the breakdown of the communities in which we are raised, in which we find belonging, in which we find love, that is in greater scarcity than at any time in the past. Isn't that remarkable? That paradox. We know of more murders today and more crime because we have better communication than we ever had before. And it gets amplified, and it's scary, and therefore it gets hold on to. But there's this remarkable phenomenon. And the remarkable phenomenon is when you actually look at it statistically at arm's length, there is progress. And there is challenge. And for the Jewish community, that challenge is profound. All the more in a place of choice, where you can live in a messianic way, although we're not yet in the messianic era, where you can find the loved one and based on their character and based on their attractiveness, you can choose to create a life together. That opportunity of not necessarily being grounded in one's past, but choosing your future in so many ways is a gift that we prayed for. We prayed that we would live in a time of choices. And yet, there's a price that gets paid of why hold on to the particular, why be Jewish. The shofar is a call. It's a call with a piercing, primitive sound that is not intellectual. For ultimately, why we choose to be Jewish is not because of facts, although our minds must always be vigilant. But we are drawn to being here today because we feel like this is who, on some core level, we are. That this is a family reunion. That we want to say, yes, I belong. The words of the Machzor, they may just float by. All that God talk, who knows at times what to do with it. But if you substitute the word beloved for God, and you understand, and we understand, that to be able to express the gift of life to something far greater than us, to the breath and source of life, to a beloved who gives us the awareness that each of us is unique and precious. That is the religious calling at its core. And this, the shofar, this ancient instrument, calls us to take in those sounds, and not on an analytic level, on the level of allowing that sound to penetrate, reverberate, and resonate as a sound across generations that calls us home. For ultimately, the power of religion is the willingness to open our hearts trustingly and to feel connected to something far greater than us, a community, that small aperture, and the universal. Because as Jews, we live with a purpose of a better world. The contemporary author Cynthia Ozick wrote close to 50 years ago, "If we blow into the narrow end of the shofar, we will be heard far. But if we choose to be humankind rather than Jewish and blow into the wide part, we will not be heard at all. For us, America will have been in vain." The shofar is a hologram. Here's the first thing that I find remarkable. That it's not even clear from the Torah what the trua sound is, or what you are and how you are to make it. That only comes through a family conversation across generations. For in the Torah there were also silver trumpets that were blasted, 2 silver trumpets with 1 shofar in the middle. Though for this occasion of the new year, we go back to the source of sound, to the shofar itself. And then the rabbis say, well, what kind of animal can it be made from? And there's a debate. They say it first must be from a kosher animal, but not a cow. Because when we hear a shofar, we employ our collective memory. And the memory of the golden calf, the rebellion against God, that's not how we want God to remember us. So let's not remind God, no cow horns. In fact, Maimonides, the great Jewish philosopher and legal authority, said it must be a ram's horn. This is a ram's horn, a male sheep. It should be a ram's horn to remind us of our Torah reading tomorrow, of Abraham and his willingness to sacrifice that which was most precious to him, his beloved Isaac. And so we want to remind God of the faithfulness of our ancestors, that it should bring merit upon us. And others say, well, it's not really Abraham alone that we're remembered, because this sounds, and the mitzvah of hearing the shofar is for us too. We are also to hear Sarah crying that her husband would go so extreme. We're also to hear, according to Masechet Rosh Hashanah 33b, Lamed Gimel Bet, we are to hear even the crying of Sisera's mother, the general who did battle against Israel, as she waits by the window for her son. And as she cries, we are to hear her crying. Just like on Yom Kippur, where we take our finger and we take wine out of the cup for each of the 10 plagues, to say that even in our moment of rejoicing, it's tempered by the awareness that God as parent is also troubled by the tears and the loss of any human being. When we hear the shofar, the rabbis remarkably choose to remember Sisera's mother's wailing, that we are to be aware that in the world there are tears, and that when we gather as community, the one commandment we have in our prayer space is that there be a window, that we are not to be closed off from the world, but to hear the tears beyond, to know that the work is ours to do. Well, what are those tears supposed to sound like? We are a weird people in that we disagree, which is so powerfully positive. That we are a people that over the generations has said we can get along despite differences and sometimes to compromise. And so the rabbis debate there in the Talmud, what does the crying sound like? Some say it sounds like moaning. Others say it sounds like wailing. And so what do? They compromise. Hence, we have shvarim and teruah. So because this is experiential, I'm going to call the sounds. So I invite you to take your fingers to your lips. I do this with our preschool too. And I'll call the sounds, and you'll make the sound. Tekiah. Okay, not everyone is loud enough yet. Tekiah is the call together, to gather together, to say, I'm coming home. Come home. The bell's ringing. Tekiah, it's a whole note. Shvarim is 3 broken notes. That's the moaning. Teruah, that's the wailing. It's technically supposed to be 9 short notes, the same length as the 3 notes in duration. Or if you will, and then, which is our tradition, we always end whole. You know, you can't finish a Torah reading on a negative note. It always has to end positive. And so we end with a tekiah, that whole note, And in the final of all those blasts, we do a Tekiah Gedola, because that one points to the future. Okay, so everybody now. Tekiah. Shivarim. Teruah. Tekiah. That's great. Not as good as the sound of the shofar, but great. And a reminder of how other the sound of the shofar is. That although we reproduce those sounds, when you take them in as the sound of a horn, of an animal horn turned upside down, somehow there is a vibration across time. I love watching the children, and we had a little one who made a sound when the shofar was blasted. Where's that little child? No longer there. Maybe in the crying room. And I thought that must be the first time that child ever heard the shofar. It was like 1.5 years old. And probably won't remember it because only 1.5 years old. But that sense of listening, that's the bracha. Lishmoa, to hear the shofar, to take in the sound, and to make a sound that has been sounded across generations. We might even pause to try and remember being children and what it was like to hear the shofar. That sense of anticipation, of excitement. Some of us are newer to Judaism. You may recall the first time you heard an animal horn announcing a new year, and how it was your invitation to become part of an extended family. For the sound of the shofar, continuing with the physicality of the shofar, there needs to be a breath. All is because of the gift of life. And we're taught that our breath, our very first breath, comes as a gift to us, as it did to Adam in the Garden of Eden. Vayipach Adonai b'napav. And God breathed into Adam's nostrils, and he was animated. We each hold a breath, breaths. And the breaths that we hold, the air that we breathe, is breathing in and out everybody in this room. Hence the danger of airplanes. But on the positive level, there's a sense of our own permeability, of our own belongingness in breath itself. We breathe from our self-contained physicality into the world, and we breathe the world in with every breath. And we breathe in parts of the world. Today you can see the pollution travel, or you can see the fires travel from one state to the next. We breathe in history across generations. It is a remarkable gift. And it's a gift of life itself. For the person blowing the shofar, that person becomes our vessel of breath. They become the representative of the Jewish people. And they have to clear themselves and become a shofar, allowing their own breath to flow through them to be channeled in that small aperture, which in this context is the gift of community. We who are here today also breathe and recite words that were recited across generations. Generations that yearned for health. Generations that were grateful for life. Generations that saw themselves as having stood at Mount Sinai together as a community. The first time that the shofar is mentioned in the Torah is Mount Sinai. As people gathered shoulder to shoulder, a miracle occurred. The sound of the shofar, and Rashi, the biblical commentator, says it started softly and got louder and louder. It was a miracle. There was no instrument seen. But the sound of the shofar was the sound of revelation itself, that in a moment got silent. And in that silence, shifting from the blast of the shofar, the people experienced the immediacy of God's presence. But the rabbis teach that the sound of the shofar at Sinai continues. If we only had the Dolby, if we only had the ability to be quiet and still enough, we would still hear that voice calling us as a people to be an exemplar. What is the promise that God makes to Abraham? I will make you a great nation. I will make your name great. And name in the Bible doesn't mean I'm going to make you famous only. It means your name will be identified with character. You will be identified with goodness. And therefore, in chapter 12 of Genesis, you will be all the nations, all the nations of the world will be blessed through you. Veheyeh bracha. You will be a blessing. This is this miracle that we continue as a people across time and place to hear the sound beckoning us to be a blessing, to hear the sound of the shofar, whose translation means to be better, lishaper. That's what Maimonides teaches in the 12th century. When you hear the sound of the shofar, wake up. Don't let it just be at arm's length. Allow it to penetrate, to shake, and even to shatter. To say, if you are to be a blessing to your children, to your spouse, to your family, to your friends, and to the world, how could you live better? Lishaper is the root of shofar. That's what makes us more than a tribe. This is tribal in the best sense, the gift of belonging. This is a calling to be a people who is a or lagoyim, a source of light in the world, a source of a growing tekiah, with a recognition that it is a world of shvarim and truah, and it is our business. Because God has covenanted with us to make it our business, to take care of the weak, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. Because all are God's children. The ultimate religious calling is to see God as the beloved, for whom all peoples are God's children. And nothing makes a parent sadder than to see a child in pain. And nothing gives a parent greater rejoicing to see children loving each other. We are God's appointed to be a vessel for that Spirit, to announce the promise of one day a world that is whole. And so I want to close with a guided meditation, and then the founding president of CBI, Bob Sklar, blasting the shrill sounds of the shofar. But when we hear those sounds of the shofar, may we hold them, experience them as sounds across generations, as sounds that are of a breath, a ruach, a spirit, a soul, that links all of creation from a beloved to us. For breath is the gift of life and the gift of awareness. And may we hear those sounds, both as the call but also as the tears, that give us hope that tears become whole, because God is the healer of the shattered heart. God is close to those with a broken heart, because our beloved seeks our living a life of wholeness and peace. I invite you to rise for a guided meditation and then the sounds of shofar. Feel the earth touching your soles of your feet. Allow yourself to be aware of your posture and the gift of balance, how each of us is able to stand and breathe, taking in a breath and releasing it, taking in a breath and releasing it, knowing that every breath we take, we do so without thought. For ultimately, at our core, at our deepest self, we are vessels for life who hold breath flowing through us, in and out, in and out. And now draw your attention to a space about 1.5 inches below your belly button, below your navel. That's the low point from which breath begins. So breathe in and allow that breath to go all the way down deep. And breathe, allowing it to rise. And as you breathe in slowly and effortlessly, feel beloved. And now breathe into that spot below your navel and know that that's your core, the spot from which breath emerges. Breathe in and breathe out, feeling the gift of life. Breathing in and breathing out. And as you breathe, know that your life is gifted to be part on this day and every day that you choose. To be gifted as part of an extended family, amongst families. A family with a long history. A history that saw itself standing at Mount Sinai with the blare of a sound of a shofar calling us as a people to rise above our physicality, to be a people that aspires to goodness and even greatness as a light and an inspiration for ourselves and for others through justice and mercy, mirroring God, the source of breath, life, mercy, and goodness. Breathe in and breathe out, feeling the gift of belonging to community, knowing that to be rooted in the past is to have strength to walk toward the future. And whether you were born into community or are adopted, know that you are a member of this family and beloved by each other on this holy day of a new year. In a moment, we'll hear the sounds of the shofar. As we listen, allow those sounds to fill you the way that breath does, every pore and cell of your body. Just allow it to come in the way your breath does. In, hold it, and breathe it out. A call to come home, of the gift that you have, that we have, our home of belonging to an extended family, of an awareness through shvarim and truah that the world is not yet complete, and that we are not yet complete, that we could be more, better, kinder. And yet, that God loves us. We are beloved. And hold that final Tekiah Gedolah as both our own wholeness and the promise of a world one day healed. Tekiah. Shivarim. Teruah. Tekiah Gedolah. Ashrei ha'am sheshomeh letekiyah l'shofar. Happy is the people that listens to the sound of the tekiah, the truah of the shofar. May we know that life is good and a gift, and that we are beloved, and that God is the source of love. We open our eyes with gratitude, and we say, Amen. You may be seated.